So in 1992, the Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed. It's very important to understand what this is and how it works. And today I want to look inside this convention and see a little bit more about how it works and some of the difficulties that exist within the structure of the text. The Framework Convention on Climate Change is a formal agreement between states. It's a convention, sort of like a treaty. It produces rules that guide consent-based governance. So it's governance by consent, and the convention establishes rules and principles by which that governance or discussions around that governance are to occur. It's a piece of international law. It's a document that contains 26 articles. It looks like this. It's a bunch of words on a page. And the meaning of these words and what they do and don't allow and what they do and don't seek to achieve is the fundamental starting point for all the subsequent development around the climate regime. And these were laid down in the negotiations leading up to the Rio Convention. I want to highlight some of the key issues in this document by focusing on some articles. The ultimate objective of the convention, the reason why it exists, what it seeks to do, is stipulated in Article 2. And it says the ultimate objective of this convention is to achieve stabilisation of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. So the ultimate objective of the convention is to prevent dangerous climate change, and there's some attempt to stipulate what that means with respect to ecosystems adapting naturally, whatever that means. That's quite a difficult idea. Food production not threatened, there's all sorts of variables that go into food production that are not related to climate. Cost of fertiliser, cost of pesticide, food prices, distribution of land, and so on. Sustainable economic development is also quite a difficult concept. So the convention, and a difficulty here is it doesn't really specify what it means by dangerous climate change. What level of greenhouse gas emissions is dangerous climate change? That's unspecified. Is it 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide or of carbon dioxide equivalent, or 450, or 550, or 650? And each country has a different idea about this level. The small island states say that dangerous climate change is above 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, which is something less than 450 parts per million. Other countries have higher tolerance levels. Some refuse to specify at all. There was an effort by the research community to argue that 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, about 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, was dangerous climate change. But that's not an acceptable solution to anybody, really. And that was agreed in principle, 2 degrees, at Copenhagen too. So some sort of informal norm around 2 degrees has formed, but it doesn't satisfy the most vulnerable countries, particularly the small island states. Danger is relative to different countries. The difficulty is, and even though 2 degrees is something like a loosely established norm, it's not in the convention text. And so the whole point of this thing, the very reason why it exists, its ultimate objective, the reason why anybody takes it seriously, turns up to the meetings and talks to each other, is actually not very clearly specified at all. This is like getting 100 people together in a room and saying, we're going to do something. It might be a bit more specific. We're going to build a house, without saying what the house is for, how many rooms, how it's to be designed, or anything else. We'll just talk around a very vague objective. And it's a problem. It's very difficult for negotiators to tie any particular issue or development in the convention back to whether or not we'll achieve the ultimate objective of the convention, because the ultimate objective of the convention is very poorly specified. It's a fairly fundamental difficulty. The convention is informed by principles like common but differentiated responsibilities, which acknowledge that while everybody has a responsibility, it's common. Some countries have more responsibilities than others, depending on their historical emissions, their capacity to reduce emissions, their capacity to pay, and so on. And that's a good and well-established principle. A second principle is about recognising the specific needs and circumstances of developing country parties. those that are particularly vulnerable to climate change, as well as those that would have to bear a disproportionate or abnormal burden under the convention. This is a very interesting addition of the text. What does that mean? So the first bit we understand, those that are particularly vulnerable need to be recognised. Bangladesh, small island states, least developed countries, and so on, particularly vulnerable. But who bears a disproportionate or abnormal burden under the convention? What does that mean? That means oil and energy exporting countries, countries whose income depends on exporting fossil fuels and who are worried, and who were worried at the time and continue to be concerned that efforts to reduce emissions would reduce demand for fossil fuels by switching from fossil fuels, oil in particular, to renewable energy, and so reduce demand, soften price and undermine their export income. In particular, the OPEC countries, the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries. In linking most vulnerable countries' concerns in the convention, which particularly concern reducing greenhouse gas emissions and providing support for adaptation, to the concerns of countries who reduce emissions, who are really worried and opposed effectively to anything that seeks to reduce emissions, into a single article, created a really tight, conflicted tension that persists to this day, although it reached its head perhaps in the late 2000s. And I'll come back to this issue in a subsequent lecture. Precautionary principle also exists, and it's a good one. Where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing actions. Which is to say, countries can't say, until we've got scientific certainty that this is a problem, until we've got scientific certainty about the nature of impacts, we won't do anything. The precautionary principle says, actually, that's not a reason for inaction. There's enough reason for concern. Even if we don't have full certainty, action is required. The precautionary principle is a good principle, and you'd have to say that at some level it's been effective, and including it in the convention text was a very good idea. The convention requires things of parties. It requires them to report on their greenhouse gas emissions. It requires the developed countries and economies in transition, those economies who are in the former Soviet Union principally, are required to take measures to reduce their emissions, shall take measures on mitigation. However, what those measures entail, the level of those emissions is unspecified and was not specified until the Kyoto Protocol in '97. The consequences for failing to reduce those emissions, issues around compliance, have never been specified. So there's an obligation, but it's not in any sense legally binding, nor is it clearly specified. It requires the wealthy countries, but not the economies in transition, to provide financial resources to help countries report to the convention, to prepare their national communications, which are reports that countries submit taking measures of their greenhouse gas emissions, reporting on their vulnerabilities and the steps they're taking to adaptation. And the cost of doing that in the South Pacific, it's about $400,000 US to prepare a national communication, are met by the rich countries. And it also requires the developed countries to take measures to assist particularly vulnerable countries. Although again, this isn't specified, and what form this takes is never clear. But there has been some funding under this convention article since the convention began to assist with vulnerability and adaptation. Article 7 establishes that there shall be conferences of the parties to the convention where parties come together and talk, report on their progress, negotiate further commitments and so on. The first of these was held in 1995 in Bonn, in Berlin, I beg your pardon, and established what was called a Berlin Mandate, which set in place a process to establish stronger and binding commitments, recognised early, at least by some countries, as early as '95, that a binding and mandatory emissions targets were required, and created a negotiating process to lead to that. And what it led to was the Kyoto Protocol, which was signed in '97. And various COPs, depending on conferences of parties, depending on what you're interested in, have been important, some more than others. The 6th Conference of Parties in The Hague was dramatic, introduced a number of issues that were contentious, the use of sinks to sequester carbon, forests in particular, raised questions about compliance, what happens if countries don't meet their commitments, discussions around this problem about should issues to assist countries who are most vulnerable to adapt be tied up with issues and progress on issues to assist countries who might be impacted, oil exporting countries impacted by Kyoto Protocol. And should these two things be negotiated concurrently or should they be treated separately? Very difficult. Issues around sinks and compliance were very tricky. COP6 was not concluded, and so a second COP6 BIS held in Bonn subsequently had to be scheduled, and at that point the United States formally withdrew from negotiations on the Kyoto Protocol. So it's a very dramatic conference of parties. The seventh one, the subsequent one in Marrakesh, was notable because it established a number of funds under the convention which were administered by the Global Environment Facility, including the Least Developed Countries Fund, the Special Climate Change Fund and the Adaptation Fund. The idea of these was created. The Adaptation Fund took some years to finally be implemented. Bali in 2007 was notable because Bali was the point at which something had to happen to create a negotiating process to implement an agreement that would follow on from the Kyoto Protocol. And it created a thing called the Ad Hoc Working Group on Long-Term Cooperative Action, which was a dialogue to work towards an agreement to follow from the Kyoto Protocol. It was a big conference, 11,000 delegates, 3,500 people from governments. And just that number is quite interesting. Just to pause on this, there's 11,000 people at the conference, 3,500 from governments, so only 3,500 are from formal parties to the convention who are able to actually engage in negotiations and in all the various side meetings about the drafting of text and the horse trading around words that go on. So 2/3 of the conference are not actually engaged in the actual business, the actual face-to-face, let's talk about issues that goes on between governments. And of the 3,500 from governments, many of those are non-negotiating members of delegations. They might be industry leaders or NGO representatives or support people or whatever. The actual number of people who are seriously engaged at the coalface of negotiations, who are trading words and trading ideas, is far, far smaller than that. Actually, the COPs often end up unresolved and often end up, the critical issues come to the head usually on the last night of a 2-week meeting with a group called the Friends of the Chair, who typically involve some people from Europe, a small island states representative, someone from the United States, someone from China and India, from the main players, group of 77, least developed countries group, trying to resolve their differences so that some resolution, even if it's non-binding and not particularly satisfactory, is issued, so progress can still be said to be made. So often, 11,000 people, 3.5 people on delegations of parties, perhaps a couple of hundred of them doing serious negotiations, and at the end of the day, perhaps 16 or so of them in a room overnight trying to work it out, is typically the pattern. There's a lot of movement and a lot of people, but the real core of this is quite small. COP15 was even bigger. It was when an agreement had to be reached to implement an agreement that followed the Kyoto Protocol, and negotiations failed and agreement was not reached. And so the binding emissions that are created under the Kyoto Protocol and imposed on a set of countries will not be followed by a subsequent series of binding emissions. It was huge. 125 heads of state went to Copenhagen. 193 countries, 45,000 people. Big show, not much of a result. And you may remember various media around that time. Perhaps, to my way of thinking, in addition to a very poorly specified ultimate objective of the convention, another really critical underlying difficulty with the convention is that there are no rules about making decisions. Article 7.3 of the Framework Convention talks about decisions, and it says that parties shall, at its first session, adopt its own rules of procedure, as well as those of the subsidiary bodies established by the convention, which shall include decision-making procedures. No rules about decision-making were made. Parties could not agree on what the rules about decision-making should be. So it isn't the case that a simple majority of parties in support of a decision carries a day. The decision won't be passed. It isn't the case that if 2/3 of the parties agree on a decision, that the decision is made and carried the day. There are, in fact, no rules that specify this. There are no rules about what constitutes a decision. So, in principle, agreement on anything in a convention, agreement about anything at all, the opening stanza of a piece of text, whether or not we welcome the report of the IPCC or whether or not the convention recognises the report of the IPCC, requires the consensus of all parties. Theoretically, in the absence of decision-making rules, everybody has to agree all the time on every single thing. Take 193 people, put them in a room and ask them to agree on anything. Take 193 countries represented by their lawyers with diverse interests and try and get them to all fully agree on everything. It doesn't work very well. It's very, very slow. It's very, very cumbersome. This is a fundamental underlying problem with the convention that really slows it down. So what it means is, effectively, any objection to a decision, any objection to a proposal by any country is effectively, at least for a period of time, a veto. If 190 parties, 192 parties, or whatever the majority minus one is, says we would like to create a working group on coral reefs, and one country says no, then that's a veto. It will at least have to go into a subsequent discussion to make that party agree, and that may, depending on who the party is, become a very slow and really drag things out. And it depends a bit on who you are and which country objects. If China, or if the carbon superpowers, China, the European Union, India, the United States object, then a single country objecting is a very significant problem. When the United States withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol, they were no longer able to participate in discussions under the Kyoto Protocol about a successor agreement. A whole parallel process had to be created about long-term cooperative action that included the United States, simply because one country didn't want to be part of the discussions anymore. Small countries who might object are perhaps more easily overruled. Their objections are perhaps more easily dismissed than the big ones who have a lot of carbon power or have a lot of economic power or have a lot of diplomatic power or a lot of power in world affairs in general. Not all parties are equal with respect to their power, their ability to veto processes and slow it down. In practice, examples exist, and there is a process where dissidents and single individuals or single groups of individuals have slowed things down, objected and opposed things ardently, but have ultimately, decisions have been made despite their objections. And a good example of this is OPEC, the oil exporting countries who frequently object to everything all the time because they are concerned about the effect of reducing emissions on their export revenues, have slowed things down a great deal, have objected and they believe their reasons are sound, but in the end often their concerns have been overridden by the concerns of the majority. But its principal effect is to really slow things down, and if it's a very powerful country, it can really, really delay things for long periods of time. What this means is that for countries to be powerful, it helps for them to build coalitions and act as groups and act in blocks, particularly small countries. An individual country like Kiribati, which is small, has very little diplomatic or legal power in the convention, is far more likely to be effective, and its concerns are far more likely to influence the negotiations if it acts as a group with other small island states. And so the 44 small island states do work collectively on almost every issue under an umbrella organisation called the Alliance of Small Island States. This issue about no rules of decision making is really problematic, and it can't be resolved. It frequently is the case where a discussion will occur about trying to establish rules around decision making. But to establish a rule around decision making requires the full agreement of countries, because that's a de facto situation. They can never reach full agreement about decision making, so no rules about decision making are ever established. So the convention is a complicated legal agreement. It's a big document, and the experienced negotiators who've been doing this a long time carry around big fat boulders full of text that carry negotiating text, agreements and precedents that have been set in this negotiation process for now over 20 years. A really complicated legal process. There are hundreds of actors. The convention itself has very vague objectives, and there's no rules about decision making, and these mean this is a very complicated, very slow and very cumbersome institution.